There is a particular hush that lives between the ticks of a clock, a space thin as frost where your mind can wander without being noticed by time. And it is in that hush the first question arrives. What if the laws of physics do not merely allow time to be measured, but to be traveled, as surely as a ship threads a current or a bird rides a thermal into invisible heights, hovering at the edge of the unknown? Humanity has paced this shoreline since stories first found firelight, imagining fishermen who sleep beneath the waves and wake to centuries gone, riders who enter a ring of standing stones and return to a village now built upon the bones of their own houses, and kings who visit the halls of the divine and descend to find their daughters' grandchildren old and gray, as if time itself rearranged the furniture while they stepped into another room. In the Mahabharata, there are hints of cosmic timing that would leave an ordinary life undone, as when a visitor to Brahma's court returns after what seemed a meeting and finds ages unraveled, an echo of the Japanese tale of Urashima Taro, whose brief stay in a sea palace dissolves into centuries when he returns to shore, a motif repeated in medieval legends of fairy mounds where a dance ends and the world has slipped across a chasm, as though myth recorded a fringe effect of a deeper rule. For centuries, physics clung to the comfort of absolute time, a Newtonian procession where seconds were as universal as sunrise, a vast and even drumbeat unperturbed by motion or mountain, until the 20th century loosened the drumskin and found, instead of certainty, a fabric that stretched with speed and sagged with gravity, a revelation so quiet it remained thunder for those who could hear. Einstein's special relativity braided space and time into a single tapestry and announced that clocks disagree when they travel fast or linger in gravity's embrace. That time is not a single river, but a confluence of streams whose currents quicken and slow, so that the word now loses its universal crown and wears instead a local badge, as if each observer lives by their own lantern's light. In that geometry, the world becomes a gallery of worldlines, elegant strokes through a four-dimensional canvas, and the interval between events' proper time belongs to the path itself, whispering that time might be measured the way distance is measured, with rulers laid not along streets but along journeys, a simple thought with an astonishing consequence waiting in the wings. If you carry a precise clock aboard a jet circling the globe, it will fall out of step with its twin on the ground, a gentle defiance documented by atomic ticks that disagree by just enough to keep faith with the theory. And muons born in the upper atmosphere will live long enough to reach detectors below precisely because their swift rush borrows a measure of longevity from time's pliable weave. On mountaintops, time runs a fraction faster than in valleys, a fact that keeps your satellite navigation honest by folding gravitational redshift into its algorithms. So daily life already depends on a universe where time is not a lawmaster's baton, but a responsive medium, a sea whose currents we have mapped enough to sail, yet not enough to know what lies beyond the fog. Light cones bloom at every event, delimiting the possible, the permitted, and the unreachable. And within those cones, causality holds court with a dignity you can feel in your bones. Yet at the edges, where geometry kinks and curves, where rotation tugs at space-time, as surely as a dancer's skirt strange verdicts appear, as though the courtroom itself is beginning to spin. Consider the block universe, a serene and unsettling picture in which past, present, and future exist like a sculpture waiting for your gaze to carve a path, where becoming is merely the way the sculpture is experienced along a particular world line. And if that statue exists, then perhaps so too do loops in the marble, curves that return to themselves and invite questions about footprints that precede their makers. Even without fanciful machines, we already travel into the future by breathing faster atop mountains and slower at sea level, by racing in orbit and lingering in deep wells of gravity, a quiet procession of divergent clocks that makes every reunion a calculation. And if forward travel is so mundane at the edges, the thought begins to stir that perhaps the other direction is not an impossibility, but a test we have yet to set up correctly. Historical whispers noticed the asymmetry long before equations did, telling of monks who slept centuries and awakened to a changed language, of saints who vanished into caves and emerged into strange kingships. But modern whispers bring equations with them, exacting and cold, suggesting rotating universes and cylinders and strings that might permit a traveler to step back and lay a finger upon an earlier page, if only the ink of reality does not smear. Some solutions to Einstein's field equations seem to permit closed time-like curves, paths through spacetime that are everywhere local and lawful, yet globally circle back into their own yesterday. And when mathematics opens such a door, the question shifts from if to how, and then to what price must be paid for such an audacity, as if a toll is posted at the threshold, and we can just make out its shape in the dimness ahead. You stand, then, in that hush between ticks, knowing that physics already lets clocks disagree and world lines wander, and the question hovers like a gull at the lip of a wave. Where, in the lawful ocean of space-time, do the currents curl back upon themselves? And what happens to those who brave the eddies and return with sand in their pockets from beaches the rest of us call yesterday? Imagine riding a beam of morning sunlight as it slips along the edge of a planet's shadow, the world below spinning slowly and the stars beyond refusing to hurry. And then imagine the hum of a ship that approaches that light speed, the interior calm, but the onboard clock reluctant, its seconds stretched as gently as a cat elongates under warmth, so that a voyage taking months from within leaves decades, pressed like dried leaves into the calendar you return to. The so-called twin paradox is no paradox, but a story about geometry. One twin tracing a straight, still line on Earth, while the other arcs through space-time, with acceleration and turnarounds. And when the reunion comes, it mirrors the reunion of two travelers comparing maps, each correct by their route, yet unavoidably discrepant, an asymmetry earned by the bending of a path, as if time itself paid out extra chord to the one who rounded more corners. Gravity adds its own slow music to this chorus, stretching time in wells so deep the lenses of galaxies bend light like glass, and near a black hole's edge the seconds become thick, treacly, a syrup that traps the flicker of events, so that an outside observer sees their fall freeze and smear, while from within the fall is gentle, local, ordinary, a continuity that makes you wonder what mundane moment hides at the horizon for someone who has never looked away. Experiments have pushed this softly, raising clocks by mere centimeters and finding measurable changes, a triumph of patience that reveals time as an atmosphere of sorts, thinning with altitude. And when you look at a network of GPS satellites, you are looking at a man-made constellation, obliged to compensate for velocities, eagerness and gravity's reluctance, a choreography that would fail without a quiet respect for the pliability of time. If future travel is so accessible, then one imagines practical pilgrimages to the future becoming acts of engineering, a long orbit around a supermassive black hole to wait out a civilization's peril, a near-light cruise to watch 1,000 years bloom into an evening, a future reached by presence rather than surpassing, as though a monastery could be built out among the cold stars, where time's pace is a chosen discipline. Ancient calendars kept vigil against such wandering, inscribing cycles within cycles to tame the fear that time might have hidden shortcuts. The Maya tracking Venus, the Egyptians courting the Nile's flood with Sirius's rising, while folklore warned of glens where time ran differently, as if culture stitched fences where physics left holes, a psychological architecture to keep the village anchored against the drift. Yet forward travel is a gracious host compared to the scowl of yesterday, for as soon as thought turns back, a gallery of paradoxes steps forward, introducing itself with polite menace, and the most famous, the grandparent conundrum, is both a narrative and a question about consistency, about whether the universe permits a thread to be cut where it must have been woven first, a contradiction that does not frighten mathematics so much as sharpen its curiosity. Some have tried to answer by limiting the kind of strokes one can draw. Perhaps the texture of laws is such that any attempt to force a contradiction resolves into a self-consistent loop, like dropping a billiard ball through a wormhole. and finding it emerge to nudge itself, just enough to make the drop inevitable. A neat trick that soothes logic while raising the stakes on what counts as freedom. Others suspect that the universe's kindness to causality is not a velvet rope but a wall, that there exist conjectures, unproven, intuitive, a physicist's frown rendered in algebra, that prevent the formation of closed time loops on any scale one might meaningfully exploit, the equivalent of a cosmic sign that reads no U-turns beyond this point, posted in ink yet to be mixed, but hinted at in a careful reading of what infinities try to do. Because Einstein's equations are permissive in a peculiar way, admitting solutions that no one expects to be realized, but which must be faced because the field equations do not flinch. And among those are the rotating universes and cylinders and strings that promise backward steps, a promise tangled with the difficulty of building such spacetimes, as if architecture has the right to veto a dream. When observers tell tales of ships disappearing in naval yards and reappearing fused with their own hulls, or of government stations tuned to the hum of time, like a radio seeking a station that will never quite come in, they are playing with kindling set under this structure, stories that answer emotional equations with satisfying curves, even as physics stands apart with a clipboard, willing to listen but happier to verify. The forward path, then, is well lit and securable, a corridor whose floorboards have been tested with careful boots, while the back staircase is dim and full of steps that every equation says could be there, though the architect may have hidden them behind panels we have yet to find, and the building moans as you put your ear to the wall, wondering which way the sound runs. One of the first blueprints for a backward staircase arrived in 1949 when Gödel found, within general relativity, a rotating universe in which closed timelike curves thread through the cosmos like ivy, a mathematically consistent world where every event has a path back to its own neighborhood, an elegant result that nonetheless disagrees with observations of cosmic expansion, leaving its strange corridors empty but not erased. A more localized scheme imagines a massive, infinitely long cylinder spinning near light speed, its rotation dragging spacetime into a swirl that allows a traveler to loop through time. A construction attributed to Tipler, yet haunted by the word infinite, as if physics allowed the door, but geology refused to supply the stone, reminding us that existence is often limited by the raw materials of the universe. Cosmic strings, hypothetical filaments left from the early universe, carry another whisper of possibility. Two such strings, sliding past each other at high speed, could induce closed time-like curves in their wake, a thought experiment so austere it draws beauty from its own improbability, the way a mirage draws beauty from heat, making you thirsty not for water, but for a better question. Then there are wormholes, theoretical tunnels connecting distant regions of spacetime, which, if stabilized and manipulated, could serve as time machines by moving one mouth relative to the other so that clocks ticking at their throats disagree, and a comey passage through becomes a stroll along a temporal gradient, a device imagined with care in the equations by Morris and Thorne, as peacefully detailed as an engineer's rendering of a bridge that spans a canyon of risk. But these constructions demand exotic matter, a phrase that sits like a talisman on a workbench, invoking negative energy densities that ordinary matter refuses to provide, a resource glimpsed in the Casimir effect as two mirrors draw closer in a quantum vacuum and a sliver of negative energy appears between them, small and delicate and insufficient, like catching dew in a thimble and calling it a river. Stephen Hawking proposed chronology protection, a witty name for a serious suspicion that quantum effects proliferate near would-be time machines, producing divergences that flood the apparatus with energy, a feedback that closes the loop before it opens, like a theater whose fire alarms kick in at the first hint of smoke, a built-in safety that no designer intended yet every patron appreciates when the lights remain steady. Each suggestion runs into an energy condition, an inequality, a physical common sense encoded in mathematics that resists the extremes necessary for time loops. And while theorists have learned how to relax these conditions in particular contexts, the cost is always printed somewhere small on the bill, inviting the sort of practical impatience that eventually distinguishes fantasy from ambition. Yet the conspiratorial fog does not thin easily, drifting in with tales of naval experiments in Philadelphia, where sailors allegedly vanished and reappeared in walls, with stories of deserted radar rooms lit by static that was rumored to be time itself, with legends of laboratories tucked into worn-down military bases, where chairs and cages in coils listened for whispers from tomorrow, narratives that keep their power not by proof, but by atmosphere. The Montauk Project enters here like a ship at night without lights, a rumor of boys pulled into machines and cities glimpsed through pain, the kind of story that cannibalizes genuine research into electromagnetism and dressing it in shadows, blending government secrecy with the allure of temporal chaos, while physics, patient and dry, sits with equations that insist any true time loop will bring along an accounting you cannot ignore. John Teeter's dispatches from an alleged 2036 were posted with technical flair, sketches of micro-singularities and control systems, a voice that quoted scientific papers and wrote about divergent world lines with a confidence that weathered skepticism. And whether hoax or art, the episode points to a recurrent hunger, that a detailed manual might arrive one morning, ordinary in style, yet splashed with the extraordinary, an instruction for stepping sideways into a day already lived. Even the Vatican has its temporal ruler, a chronovisor said to capture images from the past by tuning into the cosmic echo of events, a machine that, if real, would convert the ancient wish to witness history into an active instrumentation, though its alleged custodian supposedly sealed it away, an invented decision that reads like a moral inserted into an apocryphal text, a caution that some doors should remain closed, even if they can be locked. Meanwhile, in the journals and seminars, the question quietly narrows. If the equations allow a loop and the materials refuse it, is the block universe like a legal code with clauses that are constitutional but unenforceable? And if quantum fields rise up when we attempt to pass sentence, is the law of causality protected by a noise so loud you cannot even begin to speak, a riddle that sits at the edge of our hearing? A traveler standing beside such a machine would hear the universe clear its throat before drawing breath to object, and that suggestion, the cosmos enforcing chronology not by decree but by self-interference, hangs like a low cloud over the landscape, making you wonder what quantum weather moves through the valleys of time, and whether any window can be opened without inviting a storm. If general relativity curves the streets, quantum mechanics changes the lighting, throwing shadows that sometimes look like they arrive before they're cast. And while the underlying equations respect time reversal, in a deep way preserving a symmetry that remains, hidden in daily experience, certain experiments invite us to imagine what it means for cause and effect when measurement itself arrives late and yet appears to decide an earlier story. Wheeler's delayed choice suggests that whether light behaved like a wave or a particle seems to depend on an apparatus chosen after the light has already meandered through a maze, and although no information races backward and no paradox blooms, the staging leaves a residue of unease, like discovering that the play you watched last night altered its ending when you wrote your review this morning. Entanglement strengthens this unease without breaking causality, pairing quanta so that their properties are correlated beyond distance, while stubbornly refusing to transmit messages faster than light, a tuning of the universe that hints at a choreography offstage, a coordination that does not care about miles or minutes, as though the script were written in a room we cannot enter, and yet whose drafts trickle under the door. Some interpretations lean into retrocausality, suggesting that influences can be bidirectional in time at the microscopic level without producing the macroscopic contradictions we dread, an idea that feels like describing a river that returns to its springs underground while still flowing seaward above, a two-level plumbing that satisfies continuity without committing to overt loops. Deutsche proposed a quantum model for closed timelike curves, in which consistency is achieved by letting systems entering a loop interact with a version of themselves and settle into fixed points of evolution, turning paradox into equilibrium, a mathematical morphing that promises computational advantages and scrambled intuitions, as if a quantum computer placed near a time machine could solve problems by letting answers stabilize their own questions. Novikov's self-consistency principle, though classical in origin, becomes a natural companion here, insisting that events within a time loop must arrange themselves to avoid inconsistency, not by decree, but by the impossibility of incompatible initial conditions. A universe that refuses certain starting points, the way a locked lock refuses wrong keys, a refusal that feels physical, even before it feels philosophical. The arrow of time remains a harder riddle, because the microscopic laws do not prefer yesterday or tomorrow. Yet macroscopic life moves from low entropy to higher, accumulating irreversibilities, like soot, a bias we attribute to initial conditions, a past hypothesis that the universe began unusually ordered, and to the neglect of correlations that we discard as heat, a neglect that gives time its direction even if its rules do not. Loschmidt's paradox asks why entropy increases if the microscopic laws are time-symmetric, and the answer circles back to how we coarse-grain, to how we ignore molecules' details, to the way information and energy trade roles in machines and demons, with Landauer reminding us that erasing information heats the world, making memory itself a furnace, a beautifully unnerving observation that binds mind to thermodynamics with wire we cannot see. Poincare recurrence whispers that any finite system will eventually revisit states arbitrarily close to earlier ones if you wait long enough. A theorem that sounds like immortality for arrangements, and yet is nullified by practical timescales that dwarf the age of stars. A reassurance and a threat at once, suggesting that time, like a garden in winter, has patterns hidden by the shortness of our stay. Time crystals add a new motif, systems that exhibit periodic structure in time as ordinary crystals do in space, breaking time translation symmetry under driving in a stable way, a phrase breaking symmetry sounding violent, but being, in physics, a way to reveal texture, to wring order from rules that do not insist on it, a subtlety that implies time can host patterns we might learn to tune if we dare to play. When you place these pieces near one another, the permissive architecture of general relativity, the slippery correlations of quantum theory, the thermodynamic insistence on direction, you get a mosaic in which time travel is never strictly forbidden, but is gated, hedged and encumbered, like an ancient right-of-way that exists on maps, but is overgrown and guarded by unsettled weather. At the edge of this mosaic is the laboratory, where ultra-cold atoms mimic curved spaces and superconducting circuits simulate exotic boundary conditions, letting researchers press against the outlines of causality without tearing it. Experiments that feel like watching models of storms in a tank, learning which eddies can form and which cannot, and the real ocean waits beyond the door. There are whispers that even information itself might be the more primitive layer, with space-time emerging from entanglement patterns, the way a melody emerges from notes, an idea that reshapes our question from how to move through time to how time arises. And if time is emergent, perhaps travel is less of a vehicle and more of a reconfiguration, less a door and more a change in the room that was already around us. Philosophy steps into this dim corridor, carrying a lantern, asking whether the block universe is a map or a territory, whether all events exist as a four-dimensional whole, or whether the present is a growing edge, a frost line advancing through a field. And in that difference lives our intuition of choice, of freedom, of becoming, each view making different promises about how a traveler might step without treading a path that was already carved. Presentism insists only the now is real, a comforting severity that mostly collapses under relativity's relativity of simultaneity, while eternalism seats past and future at the same table, a vision that appeals to geometry but strains our sense of agency, and the growing block attempts a compromise, holding that the past is fixed and the future not yet added, an evolving sculpture whose completion remains uncarved, a set of stances that ripple through any practical design for a time machine by suggesting what, exactly, is being navigated. Bootstrap paradoxes gently haunt the conversation, tales in which information loops without origin. A manual found that teaches its own invention. A violin sonata never composed, but perpetually performed. Narratives that are internally consistent, and yet leave a taste of transgression, as though causality can be satisfied, while history remains unnourished. A diet that sustains, but does not explain. Black holes add their deep-bellied note, places where time slouches and curves, until it becomes inwardness itself. Raising the information paradox, when quantum mechanics insists that information cannot be lost, while classical gravity insists the horizon is an eraser. A tension that has produced conjectures like E equals EPR, a playful equation suggesting that entanglement and wormholes are two faces of one connectivity, turning tunnels into ties that bind. The holographic principle adds another mirror, proposing that the contents of a volume can be described on its boundary, that gravity in a bulk corresponds to a quantum field theory without gravity on an edge, a duality under which time in one description can translate into different structures in the other, inviting a daydream in which what we call time travel is a boundary reshuffling that leaves the bulk, feeling both disturbed and intact. Cosmology reminds us we live in a universe with a horizon, dark energy pushing space to expand until portions recede beyond communication. A stage that acts like a one-way curtain for certain observers. And in such a theater, sending messages to one's own past may be less plausible than sending them to another's future. A humbling twist that reframes ambition as outreach rather than return. Engineering fantasies sketch warp drives that compress space ahead and expand it behind. Alcubierre's bubble gliding without violating local light speed. And yet the specter returns. Any technology that enables faster-than-light effective travel tends to enable closed timelike curves in some frames, inviting paradoxes back through the door, and the energy budget calls for negative densities and magnitudes beyond reasonable extraction. A grocery list written in currency we have yet to mint. Quantum inequalities restrict how negative energy can be arranged, forbidding us from simply piling up the exotic where we please. And the stability of space-time under such manipulations remains suspect, a suspicion that translates into a practical warning. Even if a time machine could be coaxed into a transient state, it might be a volcano under glass. Beautiful until it isn't, a sculpture that hums with dangerous potential. Suppose we settle for signals instead of bodies, for faint fingerprints sent across time's grain, rather than footprints pressed into yesterday. Then we imagine neutrino beams encoded with prime patterns bouncing through supernova remnants to arrive at detectors at moments chosen with care, or gravitational waveforms modulated by binaries to carry tiny signatures across cosmic ages. Approaches that stay within causality, but flirt with the edge of perception. Culture will go on inventing machines that see Rome at noon when Nero frowned, or tell of files locked in vaults beneath cathedrals that play the crucifixion like an old newsreel, and men in cramped rooms, posting from futures that will never arrive. And perhaps these stories, even when false, perform a service by keeping attention trained on that hush between ticks, on the gap in which questions grow tall enough to touch the ceiling. The sober path remains a choreography of clocks and beams and cold atoms, of experiments that test consistency rather than break it. And with each confirmation that causality is stubborn and time pliable, yet loyal to its own deep rules, we learn better how to live with both the patience of a sailor, who loves currents, and the imagination of a cartographer, who suspects there is another coast. If time travel is possible, it will likely come hand in hand with a reinterpretation of time, a realization that turns motion into configuration and journey into code, that treats the past not as a place to go, but as a pattern to reconstruct under constraints we have not yet mastered. And in that sense, the work of time travel becomes the work of understanding what time is in the first place. So you rest a moment at the edge of sleep, listening to the hum of machines, the murmur of distant waves, and the steady breath of a universe that may already contain every walk you could take within it, and yet still invites you to choose a path and wonder what other paths would have felt like underfoot. A quiet dare posed by a cosmos that prefers questions asked slowly. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.